In the 1984 film Red Dawn, the beleaguered Wolverines, teen partisans defending the middle of America against a Soviet and Cuban invasion, ask a downed U.S. fighter pilot, played by Powers Booth, what started the war. His answer? The two toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight. That's the way many analysts see the current situation between the United States and its allies, primarily NATO, and China and its main military ally, Russia. With all the military spending on both sides, it only seems inevitable that they will eventually use the power they've built up to forward their global agendas. The current situation between the authoritarian East and liberal West has not been this tense in about half a century. The invasion of Ukraine has brought NATO and the United States into as close to an all-out hot war with Russia as we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But with that previous series of events cooled off before shots fired, the Ukrainian war has seen hundreds of thousands of casualties. Russia feels that many of the deaths on their side are due to the military and economic aid sent by NATO and the US to Ukraine. Putin and his political henchmen have repeatedly threatened NATO with nuclear weapons if they feel the existence of their country is threatened any more than it already is. Matters weren't made any better when Great Britain almost had one of its RC-135 reconnaissance planes shot down in September 2022, which would have raised tensions even more. There was another close call in November of 2022 when an errant Ukrainian air defense missile missed its intended target, another Russian missile barrage indiscriminately targeting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, and landed in neighboring Poland, killing 2 people. NATO has a very specific section of its agreement called Article 5, which states that any attack on a member nation is an attack on all of NATO. For a moment, talks of all-out war between Russia and NATO filled the blogosphere. Russian officials have sought to paint NATO as aggressors in the war, continually claiming that the poor little Russia was directly fighting against the massive enemy of NATO, while the US and its allies have said they are supporting Ukraine's defense with military aid and unspecified intelligence sharing, but not with boots on the ground. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, China continues to make threatening gestures toward Taiwan, including recent armed jet intrusions of Taiwanese airspace following Speaker Pelosi's trip to the island in 2022, and then Speaker McCarthy's trip in 2023. Following the more recent April trip, China effectively closed Taiwan's airspace with waves of fighter jets and for the first time made it seem like they were able to interdict any U.S. support from the east of the island. There is even talk that China might begin to require ships transiting the Taiwan Strait to undergo boarding and searching, which Taiwan says they will vigorously oppose. Are we close to a hot war? First off, let's make one thing clear. The U.S. and China are not on the verge of war. On March 31, 2023, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, "I don't think at this point I would put the possibility of imminent war in the likely category, and I think that the rhetoric itself can overheat the environment." However, General Milley did admit that it is possible that you could have an incident or some other trigger event that could lead to uncontrolled escalation, so it's not impossible. That incident would most likely evolve around an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. President Xi has publicly stated that he wants the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, to be prepared to take Taiwan by force as early as 2027, so that risk clearly does exist. Let's take a look at the 2 main theaters of such a potential war. NATO and the European elements of the United States' forces arrayed against Russia, and the U.S. forces in the Pacific, mostly naval forces, against the might of the Chinese Army and Navy. Of course, such a comparison will not include the opposing nuclear forces. Any of the combatants have enough warheads to turn vast swaths of the world into unlivable nuclear wasteland. For the purposes of this comparison, we will hope that all sides would agree not to resort to such catastrophic weapons. The opposing military strengths in Europe. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of the world perceived Russia as the second most powerful military in the world. They had massive numbers of tanks and artillery, their air force was seen as a peer with the American Air Force, and their navy was capable and feared, even if it didn't have comparable numbers to the US Navy. Russia's military fiasco in Ukraine has proven their tanks are outdated and poorly designed. Their logistics vanish once they leave their rail network, and their air force has been fragile enough that they don't dare fly over Ukrainian territory for fear of being shot down. The only 2 legs of their military that remain unbowed by these defeats are its artillery, still numerous, though notably inaccurate, and its nuclear forces, which remain unused and still unproven. As of April 2023, the widely respected research organization Oryx has documented and confirmed an astounding 10,000 vehicle losses by the Russian armed forces, including over 1,900 main battle tanks, half of what it reportedly had pre-invasion, along with 830 armored fighting vehicles, 2,200 infantry fighting vehicles, 800 pieces of artillery, 79 aircraft, 81 helicopters, and 12 surface vessels, including the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class guided missile cruiser Moskva. This is in addition to an estimated 200,000 Russian military casualties, with anything between 45,000 to 50,000 killed in action. These numbers are incredibly high from just over a year of fighting, and are far greater even than what Russia suffered in its 10-year losing war in Afghanistan. The losses are so high that in early 2023, Russia began returning 75-year-old T-54-55s into service, the equivalent of the U.S. using Korean War-era M47s. The Russia also lost a reported 1,500 officers, including 160 top-level generals and colonels, and it's clear the once-feared Russian military is a shell of its former self. Standing opposite the vastly depleted and shaken Russian military is NATO, now more united and stronger than at any time in its 74-year history. With Finland's admission into NATO in April of 2023 as its 31st signatory nation, the organization can now boast a combined troop strength of just over 3.5 million soldiers, airmen, and sailors. That includes, however, the US and its 1.4 million strong standing army, not all of which would be fighting in Europe, and Turkey's 425,000, not the most committed of NATO's members. That means the rest of NATO's 29 members contribute only 1.7 million troops total. France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Italy each have 160,000 or more active personnel, while other countries have smaller forces to rely on. It must be stated, though, NATO considers itself a defensive organization. How involved they'd be beyond their own borders is anyone's guess. It's important to note that the current war in Ukraine has shown that the NATO members, mostly led by Poland and the US, are willing to supply lethal aid, from missiles to artillery to tanks and fighter jets, to a non-signatory nation whose defense is of a vital interest to nearby NATO members. Since Russia launched its invasion in February of 2022, NATO members have increased both their military budgets and pledged a greater amount of military spending per capita. They've also benefited from sending Ukraine their Soviet-era tanks and fighter jets, which have been replaced with upgraded models, many of them being state-of-the-art models from other member nations, like the US's F-35 stealth fighter and M1A2 Abrams tanks. NATO can also count on around 1,500 Leopard 2s and about 2,500 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, the majority of which are M1A2s, with the rest being the earlier M1A1s, with an additional 800 or so British Challenger 2s and French Leclerc and Ariettes. And while the number of aircraft on both the NATO and Russian sides appear about equal, NATO forces employ more 4th and 5th generation fighters like the F-35 and the improved and updated versions of the F-16. While Russia is still reliant on more outdated MiG-29s introduced in 1982, MiG-31s introduced in 1981, and the Su-27s introduced in 1985. These three plane types alone account for more than 750 of their total 1,100 available pre-invasion fighter aircraft, a disproportionate number of outdated and non-modernized platforms. And as has been seen in Ukraine, many of these aircraft have not been maintained sufficiently in order for them to be combat-ready anytime soon. It's clear that a war between only the European forces of NATO and the struggling military of Russia would be a one-sided affair. But how would China fare against a mostly US force? The opposing forces in the Pacific. China, it should be obvious, has not suffered from an equivalent loss of military strength as Russia has over the past year. In fact, the modernization and expansion of its military has been impressive and has caused its neighbors like Japan, Australia, India, and the Philippines to increase their own military expenditures. Yet China is still missing major components that will allow it to go toe-to-toe with the US Navy. These missing elements suggest China would be better off waiting at least 5 years, and possibly as much as 10 years, before it initiates an open military confrontation with the West. For example, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan, currently operates 25 of its modern 10,000-ton Type 52D destroyers, with its own version of the Aegis-type radar system, along with 8 of the more advanced 13,000-ton Type 55A destroyers, along with 6 of the earlier 7,000-ton Type 52C ships. There are up to 12 additional destroyers currently under construction. But while these ships are designed specifically for missile and aircraft defenses, they've yet to deploy with the planned HQ-26 medium-range ship-to-air missile system, which was based on the Russian 9K-37 Buk, first developed in 1972. This new missile system is reportedly equivalent to the US SM-3 missile used by the Aegis ballistic missile defense system and was expected to be able to engage short and medium-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and both manned and unmanned aircraft out to 400 kilometers. However, this capability is expected to be implemented around a year or two from first deployment and will be even longer before it's deployed fleet-wide. Until then, China's missile defense destroyers like the Type 52 and 55 will have to make do with the upgraded HQ-16B with a reported maximum range of only 70 kilometers, a system that dates from 2011. The biggest weakness in the plan, of course, is its aircraft carrier fleet. They currently operate 3 carriers, the oldest being a 90s-era Ukrainian-built Russian-designed ship named the Liaoning with its ski jump ramp, which is also a staple of its second carrier, the Type 002 Shandong. The Liaoning isn't really considered a frontline carrier and is relegated to the role of training carrier. Its third carrier, the Fujian, currently being fitted out, is equipped with advanced electromagnetic catapults, similar to those on the U.S. supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford. Some say copied directly from it. But that means the plan will have to train its carrier pilots on 2 types of takeoffs, and they'll need 2 different types of carrier planes to operate on those carriers. Its current training model, the JL-9G, a single-engine twin-seat aircraft first deployed in 2011, can't be used to duplicate emergency landings on any of its current carriers because it's too weak to take the continual pounding of carrier landings, and it's too underpowered to immediately take off in case of a missed landing. That leaves only simulated takeoffs and landings on ground-based mock-ups. This inability to field a true carrier trainer has led to a huge deficit in trained carrier pilots. The problem with the planned trainer is just the opposite of its carrier combat aircraft, the J-15 Flying Shark, which was mocked by Russia for trying to be a back-engineered version of a Su-33 prototype, the T-10K3, which they bought from Ukraine back in 2001. At a reported 17.5 tons, its upgraded version is now thought to be the world's heaviest carrier-borne fighter. In comparison, the U.S. Navy's F/A-18 weighs only 14.5 tons. The J-15 suffers from either having to carry less than optimal fuel, giving it less range, or less armament, giving it less lethality if it intends to take off from the 2 ski jump-equipped carriers. It has since been nicknamed the flopping fish by the normally reserved Chinese press for its underwhelming performance. China's begun deployment of the Chengdu J-20, somewhat comparable to the US's F-22 stealth fighter, and have produced around 200 of them, but this aircraft cannot be adapted to carriers and remains a standard land-based air superiority fighter. China hopes to make up the difference in carrier forces with hypersonic missiles, though their reliability and readiness is still under discussion. At present, there's speculation but no confirmation that China is building a 4th carrier, though at least one recent satellite image suggests a 4th might be under construction. But the plan doesn't have enough carrier pilots for its 2 current frontline carriers, let alone a 4th. In comparison, the U.S. currently operates 11 carrier strike groups, each of which is comprised of one of its nuclear propulsion Nimitz or Ford-class supercarriers able to field 70 to 80 aircraft, 1 or 2 Ticonderoga-class Aegis-guided missile cruisers for air defense and coordination, 2 LAMPS-capable warships focusing on anti-submarine and surface warfare, and 2 to 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. Each strike group is accompanied by assorted logistics and support ships and an undisclosed number of nuclear-powered attack submarines, usually 1 or 2, that coordinate with each strike group. The new Ford-class supercarriers currently in use by the U.S. Navy are undoubtedly the most powerful warships ever produced, with 1 in service and 4 more planned or currently under construction to be delivered between 2024 and 2034. There are literally no carrier groups of such lethality in any navy in the world, though the British and French navies do have their own carrier battle groups with somewhat comparable strengths. The U.S. also deploys several amphibious-ready groups built around the Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, in essence a small carrier, which can handle 6 fighters like the F-35 Lightning II and up to 24 helicopters like the Cobra gunship and the VF-22 Osprey transport vehicles. The amphibious-ready groups also include a landing platform dock ship, LPD, from the San Antonio class, capable of deploying up to 600 troops and 14 amphibious assault vehicles, and a landing ship dock, LSD, like the Harper's Ferry class and the Whidbey Island class landing ships, which can load and unload conventional landing craft and helicopters. These amphibious-ready groups can also launch dozens of autonomous drones like the X-47B. Normally 2 to 3 ARGs are forward deployed, 1 in the Mediterranean Sea or the Persian Gulf/Indian Ocean region, and 1 or 2 in the Western Pacific Ocean area. Currently, 1 ARG is based out of Sasebo and Okinawa, Japan, The ARGs are usually attached to a carrier strike group, which provides protection for them from both land and sea-based attacks. The U.S. can also count on 26 Los Angeles-class, 3 Seawolf-class, and 21 Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, as well as dozens of ballistic missile submarines, each with ICBM-capable launch tubes. On the other hand, the plan operates 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines and 40 older diesel-electric submarines of much lower capability. Many experts point to the plan's superiority in total numbers of ships over the U.S. Navy, 340 to 300, but we must consider that the plan's numbers include 150 patrol craft, which are more equivalent to the U.S. Coast Guard's cutters, designed for coastal engagements only, and not really capable of the kind of blue water combat the main naval units would engage in. In addition, while the U.S. Navy appears perfectly capable of handling the current plan on its own, any shooting war will likely involve other countries that are either wary of or outright opposed to Chinese naval power projection, including Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Following continued efforts by China to claim the entire South China Sea as their own personal swimming pool, each of these countries has begun to beef up their own naval might. Japan, for instance, is building 2 of the largest destroyers in the world. At 20,000 tons, they dwarf even the U.S.'s 16,000-ton Zumwalt destroyers. These will complement and support Japan's 2 new Izumo and Kaga carriers, converted from previous helicopter destroyers, and will operate the F-35B Joint Strike Fighter. Once complete, the 2 carriers will be Japan's first since the Second World War. Along with Japan's increasing naval might, Australia has entered into a long-term agreement with the U.S. and Great Britain to build a fleet of state-of-the-art nuclear-powered attack submarines. India has also increased its own naval strength, while the country is still aching from violent confrontations instigated by China along its northern Himalayan border. China's true Achilles heel. And that brings up the most crucial component of any possible shooting war involving China: the fact that the country must import 70 to 75% of all their oil and natural gas through a long naval route from the Baltic through the Atlantic and past Africa, India, and Indonesia. If the U.S. or its Pacific allies wanted to interdict the flow of petroleum to China, and such a lengthy supply chain would be impossible for China to protect, then China would be looking at a 3-month delay before its countrywide truck transport system would shut down due to a lack of fuel, and 6 months before it ran out of the necessary components for the production of fertilizers, which its farmers desperately need. Their economy would collapse within a year, and massive famine would break out even if they did manage to hold off the superior U.S. Navy. This dramatic and inevitable failure of their economy and the catastrophic famine that would follow might be the main reason why China isn't looking to launch a full-scale war anytime soon. Not only is it a heavy importer of raw petroleum, it's also the world's largest importer of food. Between 2000 and 2020, the country's food self-sufficiency ratio decreased from 93.6% to 65.8%. China's leaders know that if it cannot win a war outright in a very short period of a few months, and the vast capabilities of the U.S. Navy, let alone its numerous Pacific allies, suggest that this just isn't a reliable possibility, then they are dooming their country to losing their position as the second most powerful economy in the world, with a disastrous famine soon to follow. The lessons of the Ukraine war are also a stark reminder that a determined, well-equipped country, no matter how small, can resist an invader far more easily with today's advanced technological weapons. And while Ukraine has done a phenomenal job in gaining that capability in a mere 8 years since the first Russian invasion of 2014, Taiwan has been preparing itself for a Chinese invasion for more than 70 years. They're also a much more technologically capable nation and have a large 80-mile moat of an ocean that China would have to navigate in case of an invasion. This would not be an easy cross-border incursion that Russia attempted and failed, but it would require dozens of landing craft, easy targets for missiles, and waiting artillery. The fragility of a Russia-China alliance. In addition to logistical problems of overcoming the U.S. Navy and the watery moat around Taiwan, China faces another hurdle: the weakness of any long-term alliance with Russia, an alliance that would merely be a castle built upon sand. Any full-scale war short of a nuclear engagement would find Russia's military virtually destroyed within the first few weeks of the conflict's launch, leaving China virtually alone. The Ukrainian invasion has spotlighted why Russia is nowhere near the military peer to the US, China, or even NATO that people thought it was. As previously mentioned, the Russian armed forces have lost over 10,000 military vehicles, including upwards of 1,900 main battle tanks, along with around 200,000 troops. The main reason they threaten the West so often with nuclear weapons is because they know they never stand a chance against the combined forces of NATO, which have more advanced equipment and better trained troops, and now might actually hold a numerical advantage as well. There are multiple reasons for the failure of the Russian military. First and foremost is the endemic corruption that riddles every layer of the Russian government, including the military. There are estimates that corruption has cost from 25 to 30% of Russia's total annual GDP, and the sanctions Russia has endured since the start of the war has caused a massive drain of its remaining economy. Not only is Russia's economy collapsing due to the surprisingly efficient Western sanctions, but that smaller economy's spending on its military is actually much less than the projected numbers. The sanctions have also shrunk the Russian economy to the size of Italy, and now puts it behind the individual states of California, Texas, or New York. Russia's nominal $1.4 trillion GDP is minuscule when you compare to the EU's combined economic strength of about $15.28 trillion. Add the US and the EU's GDP together, you get about $35 trillion, more than 40% of the total world GDP. Russia will simply never be able to outspend the EU and its NATO counterpart, much less the US and EU combined. Second, Russia has never had a coherent NCO training program. Russia has lost at least 150 officers of colonel rank and above simply because their orders have to be passed almost directly from the leadership to the frontline troops. The members of NATO, the US, and even China understand that the sergeants and other NCOs have to have the independent authority to assess the war from the front lines and make immediate and effective changes in response. Russia has never had that level of independence, which leads their military to dogmatic, inflexible attacks that usually require masses of tanks, waves of infantry, and massive artillery bombardments, none of which are effective in a modern battlefield environment that is overwatched by drones, surveillance satellites, and reconnaissance planes. Third, Russia has never had the ability to manage their logistics at any distance from their rail network. The ignominious 40-mile-long traffic jam north of Kyiv from late February to March of 2022 was one glaring example of how their military cannot perform the simple task of keeping their tanks and transports full of fuel and moving. This lack of logistics has been further exacerbated by the introduction of HIMARS long-range rocket artillery systems, which can hit targets over 50 miles away, and newer smart ammunition including ground-launched small-diameter bombs, GLSDB, which can hit targets 93 miles away. These have been used to great success by the Ukrainian forces against Russian depots that have often been placed too close to the front, mostly due to their lack of logistical transport capabilities. The inherent weakness of an unequal partnership. There are additional signs that China is aware of Russia's much weaker role in any potential alliance and has been capitalizing on this inequality for some time now. At first, it was the Soviet Union that held a predominant role in any bilateral negotiations, allowing them to bully China into accepting unequal agreements. Things got so bad that the two countries almost launched a major war over a border dispute in 1969, one of several border disputes between the two countries since the 1920s. But Russia eventually decided it was better to arm the Chinese government in order to have an ally against the West. China, however, decided on its own that it'd be better to copy and/or steal whatever they could get, rather than pay the full price for products coming from the Soviet Union. Starting in the 1990s, China has openly copied or stolen Russian technology, leading at times to Russia having to swallow their pride as China sold knockoffs of their own frontline equipment. For example, in 1996, China debuted the J-11 aircraft, the first fighter made after the fall of the Soviet Union to feature significant Russian input. At first, it was an officially licensed Chinese-made copy of the Russian Su-27 multi-role fighter, whose sales were welcomed by the cash-poor post-Soviet state. Before long, however, China canceled their agreement and began producing the aircraft independently, eventually building over 400 unauthorized J-11s, equaling an economic loss to the USSR of more than $10 billion. Russia continues to sell its best or almost best military gear to China, even though they know the technology is likely to be copied, reducing what little technological superiority Russia still maintains over China. The policy dilemma has been compounded by the post-Ukraine effect on Russia's struggling manufacturing sector, which has left the shrinking Russian economy increasingly reliant on China's much larger economic base, further eroding any remaining compatibility in their relationship. More recently, President Xi has tried to bring China to the forefront in worldwide diplomacy. So when the UN held a vote to condemn the Russian invasion, China surprisingly abstained from the 141-5 vote to condemn the invasion, and in fact was a key leader of 34 other countries who also abstained. This was the first time that China had a chance to publicly support their, quote, partner, and they openly refused. This hands-off approach demonstrates China's desire to maintain its currently neutral stance regarding the Ukraine war in hopes of trying to establish Beijing's bid for global leadership. But they can't do that if they supply lethal aid to Russia, so they refuse to supply such support despite Putin's pleas to the contrary. When President Putin and Xi met in Russia of March 2023, Putin had hoped that Xi would offer a deal to create a direct pipeline between the two countries, making China more reliant on Russian crude oil and natural gas and giving Russia a direct buyer for their primary export. But no such agreement was reached. Xi did say publicly that China and Russia would continue to resolutely uphold the fundamental norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. But that statement blatantly ignores the illegality of Russia's invasion in the first place, which directly violates the Charter's core precepts. Putin's hopes for any concrete agreements for aid or mutual development never materialized. The summit was summed up by historian Sergei Radchenko with an old Chinese proverb, "Loud thunder but few raindrops." He then modified that statement as, "Scratch that, even the thunder wasn't all that loud." In fact, the Putin-Xi meetings actually caused further support for Ukraine, as Japanese Prime Minister Kishida used the opportunity to make a surprise trip to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky. Despite Xi's efforts to lead China into a role of peacekeeper and world negotiator, he still has to deal with the hawks in his own government. On the heels of the Moscow summit, the Guangming Daily wrote an extensive article, more of a semi-official position piece declaring the four no's that China says they will not put up with. Number 1, the U.S. should not make irresponsible remarks on normal exchanges between sovereign states. Number 2, the U.S. should not compare China-Russia relations with a small circle of U.S. allies. Number 3, the U.S. should not undermine China's efforts to promote peace talks on the Ukraine issue. Number 4, the U.S. should stop using the Ukraine crisis as an excuse to attack and sanction China. Some of this rhetoric is no doubt simply strong words, but they may also signal an effort to lay the groundwork for China to ramp up its military support for Russia's war, though so far there's no evidence of that. It gets worse for Russia. In addition to everything else that bodes ill for Russia, President Xi might not be willing to go all in on supporting a leader of Russia whose future appears very uncertain. Putin's been rumored to be in ill health for years. He was filmed walking with a limp when he visited Crimea in March of 2023. And in April, there were widespread reports that he had suffered from intense head pain, a numb tongue, and blurred vision. There have been numerous indications he might be suffering from Parkinson's disease, which manifests as an uncontrollable shaking in the extremities, primarily the hands and feet. And there are additional signs he might be undergoing chemotherapy, which can result in excessive weight gain. There's also signs that Putin has killed off anyone near him that might pose a threat to his continued dominance of the Russian government. Since just before the invasion of Ukraine, over 40 of Russia's top managers, businessmen, and high-level officials have died under unclear but very suspicious circumstances. Those deaths include being found in apparent murder-suicides, like Vladislav Aveyev, vice president of Gazprom Bank, and his pregnant wife and 13-year-old daughter, who were found dead in a Moscow apartment, while a former top manager of Novatek, Sergei Protosenya, was found hanged at his villa in Spain, with his wife and 18-year-old daughter also found murdered in the house. And Pavel Pshelnikov, director of communications at Digital Logistics LLC, a subsidiary of Russian Railways, supposedly shot himself at his home in Moscow. The deaths have become so numerous that one media source has given the wave a nickname, Sudden Russian Death Syndrome. But by and far, the most conspicuous means of death has been the archaic mid-18th century habit of defenestration, that is, falling out of a high window. Ravil Maganov, vice president of Lukoil, fell out of one at the Central Clinical Hospital of the Presidential Administration in Moscow, and in February 2023, Marina Yankina, head of the financial department of the Defense Ministry, was found dead after supposedly falling from a 16th floor of her apartment. Even when a suspect is in government custody, their lives aren't safe. Most recently, Igor Shikurko, Deputy General Director of firm Yakutskenerga, was discovered dead of unknown causes in his cell in a detention center in Yakutsk, Siberia on April 5, 2023. The extremely high number of potentially murdered rivals paints Russia in a bad light, an unstable dictatorship afraid of its own best and brightest while making enemies of its own nascent leadership. Couple that with Putin's rumored ill health, and it's just one more reason why President Xi may want to wait a year or two before cementing any permanent relationships with whoever's in charge in Russia post-Ukraine. What will Russia and Ukraine do? China and Russia are in an unenviable position. Both countries are seeing an inevitable shrinking of their populations, with China admitting an overcounting of its population during the last census by as much as 100 million. The Pew Research Center forecasts a decline from 1.4 billion people this year to 1.3 billion by 2050 and a staggering reduction to below 800 million by 2100. That's according to the UN's medium variant, or middle-of-the-road projection. Russia's upside-down population pyramid is no better. They're already experiencing a massive brain drain as a repercussion from its Ukraine fiasco, which was followed by as many as 400,000 young men who left to avoid the first conscription call-up in September 2022. Combine that with an aging population, a lower birth rate, and a decrease in life expectancy of 15 years since early 2022, and Russia's population is in free fall. Both these troubled countries might believe then that their only window to have enough young males to support a war is rapidly shrinking. That leaves Putin and Xi with a difficult, if not impossible decision: launch a war now that they're not ready for and probably can't win, or wait a few years when their populations and economies are even less capable of enduring such hardships. It's an unenviable decision for any leader to make. Want to get a glimpse into what an East versus West nuclear war would look like? Check out I Survived 100 Days of World War III, or click this other video instead.